Hello and welcome back to Jack Knives Reviews. I'm of course your host, Jack Knives. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Hulu original series, Reservation Dogs. In a Native American reservation in the outskirts of Oklahoma, there are 4 rebellious teenagers: Alora, Bear, Cheese, and Willie Jack. Recently, they've faced a tragedy as the 5th member and possibly the glue that held them together, Daniel, has killed himself. Shaken by this event, they've all changed how they were, trying to reflect on themselves, at the same time each facing their own individual struggles, especially Bear, who is given a not-so-helpful Native American spirit, and Alora, who had unresolved feelings for Daniel. Despite each of them dealing with their own personal issues, they all want to come together to achieve their dead friend's wish, for all of them to save money and go to California together. This is a show that's a little hard to really quite put into a bubble. When I originally saw the trailers for this, I was kind of expecting it to be either a straight-up comedy or a coming-of-age drama. And it's not really either. I mean, it is leaning a little more towards the coming-of-age thing. But as a person who is not at all Native, it is interesting to get a almost outsider-looking-in experience of a base outline of Native culture. It's very similar to living Hispanic and being of Hispanic culture. It has so many differences that kind of keep you intrigued. How does Native culture integrate with a suburban community? It answers questions like that don't feel forced. Like, they don't force a narrative. And the problems that they deal with are actual things that are relatable. There are many relatable things about this series that almost adults and young kids growing up can relate to. Especially if you did or are prone to getting yourself into trouble. Because it was co-created by Taika Waititi, I took it with a fistful. And I mean a fistful of salt, because I have a very love-hate relationship with the guy. When it comes to creating his own concepts and ideas, he's fantastic at it. I still think What We Do in the Shadows is a hilarious series that everyone should check out. Luckily, he didn't create this whole thing by himself. It was also co-created by a man named Sterling Harjo, who is a relative unknown, but he is of Native heritage, and he would know more about that culture than anyone. So it's good to get an outsider's perspective instead of forcing a message kind of thing, which is honestly at first what I thought was going. It's not at all where it goes. Each character is flawed, but they're all relatively flawed. Like, they're relatably messed up, and they make pretty terrible decisions, and they make pretty okay decisions at the same time. Watching the show, I felt simultaneously like an outsider, and yet like I kind of felt welcome in this culture. I mean, even though they constantly, say things like, the white man this, the white man that. And in all honesty, that may turn a lot of people off, but the thing is, you have to obviously come to the terms of realization that Native Americans have ultimately been screwed over more than almost any other culture in America. Probably, I'd hate to say, probably more than any culture in America. Forcing themselves into relocating and creating indigenous cultures that are simultaneously a part of the United States and yet not a part of the United States. How does that work? How do these things coexist? And things like that, which they hint on and they sprinkle around, yes, but it is also really interesting how they tackle subjects like dealing with shock and grief and the mundanity of suburbia. I mean, it is really interesting how they're all unique, but relatively people that you would know. I mean, it's weird because I think of a show like Letterkenny, which also talks about Canadian culture, which I'm not familiar with at all, especially rural Canadian culture, where it's out in the farmland communities and things like that. I have no idea. But it's so enjoyable that you get along with it and you understand it. Here, it's kind of more akin to something I'm used to, living in a somewhat ghetto area. Although their ghetto is fairly different than the one I grew up in, but I digress. What's interesting is seeing that each character brings a different element to the story, and they each kind of have their own relatability that just makes you connect to them. The main guy, I guess, Bear, is trying so hard to be a leader and a tough guy, and yet he keeps seeing the ghost of a fallen native warrior who died at Little Bighorn before the battle, and you're just like, is this guy having a mental breakdown, or is it actually like a cultural thing? You really don't know. There's little things that like you're like, what is going on? I think one of the most, these 4 young kids all have a shared connection where there was originally 5 of them, and the one who is no longer there, you slowly discover that he wanted to always leave. He had greater aspirations, he had greater goals, and for no real clearly given reason, he ends himself. And because of that, it leaves this hole between them. Like, are they still together out of obligation, out of grief, out of trying to just get by, or out of genuine friendship that they have? And they don't really know. Each character kind of brings a different dynamic. You have Bear, who's this trying to be leader, but he's such a weak young guy, and he's also seeing like a ghost of a Native American who's also a loser. You have Rita, who's trying to compartmentalize her mother who died young, and then she was also the one who found Daniel, and then I guess her and him had an unresolved thing where they were in love with each other, but they were too stubborn to say it to each other. You have this guy named Cheese, so his real name's Chester, but everyone calls him Cheese, who's kind of coming out of his shell, and he's this very stoic know-it-all, but not in an irritating way, in a kind of like, oh, he's just trying to constantly change the subject kind of thing. And then you have my favorite character. Her name is Willie Jack. She's a very tomboy girl, and she says the F-bomb so much, like under her breath. Like, she doesn't say like straight up F. She goes like like she cuts herself off almost. And like, she is Daniel's cousin. She was closer to him than anyone, and her parents took Daniel in because of something going on with his parents. Or it's a lot. It's a lot to absorb. I mean, I'm just telling you what's going on in the story, and you're probably like, wow, that's a lot to deal with. Now imagine that feeling, but being those kids. Like, that's a lot to deal with, especially if you're growing up in like a younger high school scenario in an indigenous area where, you know, you're kind of isolated in the world, and all you know, everyone around you is somewhat related to you, but you're kind of all distant strangers at the same time. It's a lot, but it doesn't do it in a forceful way. It does it in a very, very, very relatable way. I went in with this kind of low bar expectations going, it could be interesting, and it actually surprised me with how good it actually is. There's a lot of Native American actors I've seen in other things. There's a lot that you can like about this show, but it's also a show that I could see polarizing people, because there are things that unfortunately they do have to talk about where, you know, they do refer to the white man as, it seems like forced, but it's not. I mean, it is a part of their culture, because in reality, we all have to face the fact that Native Americans have probably been more, I hate saying the word, but more oppressed than almost anyone in American society, in modern American society. I mean, think about, they're the only culture that has essentially forced themselves into sovereignty. They've forced themselves into sovereignty And their entire existence is on the fact that they were not killed, or killed by people attacking their ancestors, or things like that. It's a lot. And that's a part of their culture. That's a part of who they are. And so, like, you think, oh, well, they're protected in this mental bubble. But then there are parts where they're outside of that bubble. They have this dream of going to California. There's a part where one or two of them go outside of their Oklahoma town that they're in, and they try going to, like, different parts, and they're traveling, and they just see how different everything is. And it's similar, but it's vastly different than what they're used to. And it's kind of weird because, yeah, that culture shock. Like, that's a relatable thing that we can all experience together. There's a lot of relatability, there's a lot of differences, and it's a really enjoyable series. It may not be for everyone, but I think if you just give it a couple episodes, it's a good watch. I give Reservation Dogs 4 out of 5. Have you seen Reservation Dogs? Let me know in the comments down below. As always, I'll see you next time.